check. Can you hear me well? I will not stand behind the podium. I will be here to touch my screen. I first want to thank Very Reverend Father Maximos for organizing this symposium and for starting with a wonderful presentation that is inspiring and that is connecting a lot of topics that we are trying to touch upon during this meeting. I would also like to thank you, Papa's Institute, and all the participants for inspiring thoughts and just for welcoming us all, for all of us to feel very comfortable within this setting where we all come from all kinds of disciplines and all of different interests in patristic studies and writings of theologians of the caliber of St. Maximus himself. Selfishly, I will focus mostly on my own passion and architectural studies and try to probe some ideas to see whether we can look at a text of Mystagogy as a potential for theory and practice of architecture. Before I start, I would also like to highlight how we as trained architects think about architecture. Most people think about architecture as a building. And I really liked very much a comment or question that we received last night after the presentation. Can we speak about different types of sacred architecture? Is it always a church? Is it always a building? And for us who are trained in architectural practice, it really resonates with the idea of architecture that is over-encompassing, that we're not only civil engineers, and that what we are trying to accomplish when we design buildings is to think about them in terms of space that they enclose. And they go from microarchitectural concepts, whether we are speaking about just the minimal elements that you need to define the sacred space, not necessarily small in scale, they can be huge, or whether we're speaking about the potential of architecture that goes beyond the walls. And this is very nicely touched by Very Reverend Father Maximus last night when he said, let us take a look at Hagia Sophia. The elements of design also include light. They also include interior decoration that is very palpable and strong in the material with the aesthetics that dematerializes the interior space and the experience within. Given this introductory comments, I would like to highlight some of the topics that are very much of interest to me for my studies of sacred architecture. When I look at Mystagogy itself, I'm reading first what St. Maximus is saying himself. He says it's about beautiful and mystical reflections or contemplations, depending on the translation that we read, beautiful spiritual theories. So he is indeed proposing that we're speaking about theory of a special kind, about Holy Church and the Holy Liturgy performed with it. Of course, I'm not an expert about liturgy, and I will focus mostly on this concept of the Holy Church. While doing this, I'm also assuming that some of the critical terms that we very often use too freely to say need some clarifications. Maximus is using terms like symbols a lot, and we assume that he is mostly speaking about symbolism. And given that his thought is developing within the network of larger Orthodox thought in the past, and of course as a living idea even today, I'm assuming that when he speaks about symbols, he is looking at them through the lenses of Dionysius the Areopagite. And I'm putting in the brackets because, of course, depending on the audience and where I present my work, I would have a nod. It's pseudo, or whether we are speaking about Dionysius, so just a little bit of justification on my part. I'm focusing, of course, for selfish reasons, mostly on celestial hierarchy, not on ecclesiastical, that is dealing about priestly issues, because celestial hierarchy offers, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful explanations about symbolism, where you realize how angels are symbols themselves. Then I also assume that when he speaks about archetype, he doesn't mention type because it's already there. And already Dionysius the Areopagite made this strong connection between type and archetype as impossible to divide between them. And this is something that I will highlight occasionally. And then we usually take that a major unique contribution of St. Maximus is essentially his theological anthropology, essentially divine science seen through the human presence and experience. Now, my major focus will be on sacred architecture in Mystagogy and how we can recognize it and even beyond. And if I manage to show some of the aspects of mystagogy that can be used as theoretical treatise, then all the historical references, whether it is 6th century or second half of the 6th century, in a way become irrelevant because theory offers itself as a truth, and it can be probed and tested through various historical examples. And you will see how some of the examples I'm choosing are far away in terms of geography and chronology to show some of the elements of Maximus' thought and how they can be embodied in church. Some of the critical questions that resonate with me, and I don't have all the answers, of course, is, again, when he speaks about the Holy Church, we understand it's, of course, about community, but architecturally speaking, is he speaking about a building or also architecture as a concept and an idea? And I'm here highlighting, I'm using a lot of text just to justify where some of the chapters are actually mentioning church and some of the conclusions that I may reach. Of course, we have heard the fourth chapter over and over again, how the body, a human body, inscribes in the body of a church and vice versa. One of the most impressive phenomena within Orthodoxy itself. And he is freely using the terms that we are familiar with from the church building itself. And I think he's also very specific and very deliberate when he uses the terms like nave, sanctuary, and altar, sacred altar, without giving us a physical reference to it. As much as I've read, he never mentioned altar table, for example. Maybe I'm reading wrong. But this is the chapter that is short, sweet, easy to return back and forth. While rereading the text, I think that actually the essence of what I would look for in terms of architectural theory will be in chapter 5. There are some other aspects that we always take for granted, starting from this, whether the church is building itself or whether sacred architecture is church building, and what are some of the possibilities to communicate these sophisticated and highly complex ideas. At some point, Maximus himself says that the church building is needed because it allows the space to comprehend all these complexities and to articulate them in a way. But there is also a different way how we can speak about church. We have seen a lot of representations, and I'm using this term scene because I'm mostly visual person myself, referring to the text itself, but also diagrammatic ways. And diagrammatic ways are tools that we as practicing architects, as trained architects, quite often use, and very often we are even at odds with our colleagues in art history because we emphasize it's not only about visual representation. And then, of course, space itself, and with just our physicality that we occupy space is always beyond visual. Of course, space of architecture is related to performative and liturgical aspects of Chalcedonian churches. Of course, not a focus of and my expertise, and it comes then to the human body and the most intimate relation to the sacred space. Another topic that I will not be able to highlight in depth, but it recurrently comes over and over again, is that in Maximus' text, I'm reading his reference to church as a kind of icon. And needless to say, the last one is essentially the one that I have started with, how I see this text also as a potential for understanding architectural theory of sacred space of Christian churches, and in particular those that I'm interested in when I study, for example, Byzantine ones. Now, looking at these critical terms again, I hope that I'm not hiding the screen. Looking at Dionysius' definition, they are sensible representations of God and divine, echoing various biblical and liturgical references. So by its own definition, starting on, I think it's an iconic theme. And then when we speak about type and archetype, Maximus highlights in text, textually, archetype over and over again, but type is always there because archetype is essentially the origin, the original type, if you wish, from which all the physical replicas are made. And then the critical issue becomes our incarnational argument, essentially God made manifest. I will not read all the references in the text that I'm now taking from Dionysius' corpus that is inspiring for some of my work. I will just highlight how holy contemplations can be therefore derived from all things, including architecture, and be fashioned from material things to symbolize that which is intelligible and intellectual. And there was also a very nice sensitive question about matter that can be addressed from various points of view. And Dionysius is giving us at least two reasons for creating types for something which is typeless, for giving shape to what is actually without shape. And first, it is essentially our lack, the ability to be directly raised to something which is highly conceptual, and material types are helping in that regard. And second, it is most fitting to the mysterious passages of Scripture that the sacred and hidden truth about the celestial intelligences be concealed through the inexpressible. And then further on, that using matter, one may be lifted up to these material archetypes. And this is essentially, I would say, that all of us touched in our discussions from different points of view. What he also highlights is to avoid one-to-one correspondences and never to forget about the great divide between the intelligible and the perceptible. And it will go beyond what is material and immaterial. I would say it will go to the core of the ontological difference itself. Now, just as an exercise, we can see how when St. Maximus, and thank you so much for the wonderful translation in English that I can understand for Thalassios' text, when Maximus is writing about some aspects of the church, he is essentially assuming and appropriating this language maybe to the audience of his own time. And he highlights the need for a church to be fashioned. And he's highlighting that his theory is about beautiful theory. And he's constantly also highlighting the need for ordination and decoration. And then he highlights the two major mysteries, of course, the incarnation of the Word and the mystery of the life-giving passion of the God. And in Scholia, he uses the term intermediaries, I would say, almost in the same way how Dionysius is using the word symbols. And it has to be associated with these theophanic symbols, actually. I will not read the entire text because you're reading silently faster than I can speak. But again, some of the snippets of my train of thought about importance of this text for our understanding the relevance of some of the critical arguments. With the incarnational argument, God made manifest, there is a major paradox, and that is the archetype is simultaneously God and image of God. This is how I think it's very critical. So church becomes the type derivative of archetype, and archetype can be apprehended. And this pairing of type and archetype should never be divided. In scholarly discussions, we like to be very precise in terms of the phrases that we're using and the focus of our research. But I think this pairing should remain always present in discussions because of ontological connection, of course, but also because of ontological difference that is experienced through human presence and activities in actual church space. So symbols are symbols, but they're of special kind, theophanic symbols imbued with God incarnate and truth and goodness, reality made sensible. And just thinking bluntly about the Eucharist, nobody is saying that they took a symbol of Christ, but Christ himself. So these are these tiny references that are going well beyond and sometimes are confusing from other studies of symbolism that would come from semiotics or other disciplines. Now that I have clarified how I'm using and thinking about some of the critical terms that Maximos is also using in his texts, there are these other questions about the Holy Church itself and what does it mean, and how Maximos is referencing some of the questions in Mystagogy. I will start with some visuals. And I will not make a lot of comments, but it comes sometimes that many of the images and frescoes and icons within Chalcedonian churches, and I'm showing the interior of church in, of church of St. Joachim in Anna in Studenica, they're not only visual language, it's interface. And we can see immediately Mary below the canopy in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in the Jewish temple, and everybody who participates in a church recognizes that this is exactly the same bema of a Christian church. And not only this, she is there and she's receiving some kind of a teaching. What kind of a teaching? I'm always thinking, is this the experiential teaching that Maximos also mentions as worthy of consideration when we speak about sacred space? This is something that I keep in mind as I go back and forth through some of the questions. The church is essentially the smallest one on the screen, and it perfectly fits as a test of Maximos' theory that it's this image of universe, visible and invisible, but also it sits within the organized space and cultivated space of the monastery, both built and unbuilt. And it is still a church, it is still a sacred space. Then we come to the chapter 3, and sky is the heavens, sanctuary, earth is cultivation of land. Also aspect that architects are always considering. And nave, ordained nave, its beauty. Some of the images and how we comprehend church in visual terms, two-dimensional, flat. In Mystagogy, he is very clear that he also speaks about material building and church construction, but with two distinct parts, sanctuary for priests, nave for faithful. Just a few images to inspire us. And here is the heavenly liturgy just above the heads of the faithful, reflecting what's happening in the sanctuary. And then some of the hidden truths, not to be seen by everyone. The second zone, very often more directly telling the stories. And the third one, seemingly presenting the space that we also occupy during the service. It is a story of parent and child. We have heard father and son, but it's a story about parent and child over and over again. So the summary is almost diagrammatically presenting how the church as an image is presented in Mystagogy. In chapter 2, it's the image of universe. In chapter 3, sensible world. Chapter 4, man. The essence of mystical theology for sacred architecture, I would say, is chapter 5, where church is the image of both man, body and soul only. Holy scriptures are also called man, and just following the Easter celebration that we had more recently, the tomb is empty, space is empty, but he's present already in the world, in Word. And chapters 8 and following are mostly liturgy. And I agree that chapters 23 and 24 are essentially a huge summation. And what is there as a potential for the theory of sacred architecture? It's, of course, theory about the Holy Church as a building, beyond the building as a concept. He's also suggesting a vision of the future church where the human body is incorruptible. He uses the term, there is no weight, weightless. Potential for the reception of the God's second coming, and church as invisible light, something that very much resonates with some of the first papers that we have heard earlier this morning. And I know that I'm running out of time. I am only on my, let's say, 10th of the 26 slides, but I will stop here and rather leave the podium to the others, and then be grateful to receive more questions as we move forward.